Hey everybody, Tim Ulbrich here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week we're going to hit replay on the timely episode from the fall of 2021, where I sat down with YFP co-owner and director of financial planning, Tim Baker, to talk about open enrollment and evaluating employer benefits. It's hard to believe it's that time of year already, but here we are, and we need to be ready to wade through the benefit packages and options that are available to us. Perhaps not the most exciting thing to do, but incredibly important, as these decisions will touch several parts of the financial plan. So as you go into making your benefit selections for 2024, Tim and I walk through on this episode considerations for choosing a health insurance plan, how to determine whether or not your employer-provided life and disability insurance is sufficient, understanding the differences between an FSA, dependent care FSA, and HSA, and what to be looking for when putting your money into an employer-sponsored retirement plan. Keep in mind as you're listening that the numbers referenced on this episode are for 2021, 2022, and you should check the irs.gov website for the most up-to-date information. Okay, let's hear a brief message from YFP team member Justin Woods, and then we'll hit play on my interview with Tim Baker.
This is Justin Woods from the YFP team with a quick message before the show. If you listen to the YFP podcast, you may learn something every now and then, either from Tim Ulbrich, Tim Baker, or one of our guests. A lot of people listen to the show, but they may not execute or implement the things they learn. As pharmacists, we know the impact of non-adherence on patient outcomes and their overall well-being. As a pharmacist myself and part of the YFP team, I talk with pharmacists every day who are confused about how to implement financial knowledge. Pharmacists share with me that they're treading water financially, maybe took a DIY approach, reached a plateau, and are confused about what to do next. Or those who worked for decades can see the light at the end of the tunnel and feel uncertain about how the next chapter will unfold. If that sounds like you, one, it is not uncommon to feel that way. And two, does it make sense for us to have a conversation to see if YFP planning can help you? Visit yfpplanning.com or follow the link in the show notes to find a time that works for your schedule.
Tim, glad to have you back on the show.
Yeah, good to be here, Tim. Looking forward to getting into open enrollment discussion. 'Tis the season. So yeah, I'm ready for it.
'Tis the season. Indeed, fall is in the air officially here in Ohio, which does mean it's almost time for open enrollment and ensuring that we're taking the time to understand and maximize employer benefits. And I think whether someone is reviewing their benefits for the first time, whether that's accepting a new position, going through another round of open enrollment, a lot to consider here, including insurance, retirement accounts, and HSAs, FSAs, to name a few. So, Tim, our team at YFP Planning includes employer benefits as a part of the planning process, perhaps an area that folks don't necessarily associate working with their financial planner on. So how does this part, employer benefits, factor into the financial plan, and why is it so important that we're looking at it in the planning process?
Yeah, I think this is another area, Tim, where like when we say comprehensive, we mean comprehensive. And it's just like kind of the same conversation with things like home purchase. Most financial advisors are not going to kind of walk you through kind of the A to Z of buying a home, because most of the time a financial advisor is working with people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, right? And the reason for that is because those are the people that have assets, and that's how they charge their fee. You know, we have many clients that are in their 20s and 30s, and things like home purchase is really important and is often a big step in their financial journey and in their financial plan. So we kind of take the time to go through that based on, I know you said it, I've said it. We've messed those, transactions up in the past, and we just don't want to see our clients do the same thing. So open enrollment's kind of the same thing. A lot of financial advisors don't really talk about this stuff because if you're working with people in their 50s, 60s, like they've done it dozens of times, right? So they've gone through this, and a lot of our clients haven't. It's not something that is kind of what we understand. And so to define open enrollment is the period of time where you can purchase or apply for health insurance for the upcoming year without a qualifying event. And usually a qualifying event is something like a marriage or a divorce or a birth of a child. So it's typically very centered on the health insurance plan, because that's the kind of the big piece of the benefits. But then what the employer does is kind of have you opt in and opt out of other benefits that they might offer,
Yeah.
which might be, life insurance, disability. I've even seen things like pet insurance and things like that. And, some things that are not insurance related could be like a legal benefit. So that's what this is open enrollment. And it's important because your employer benefits are a major component of your compensation package. And, this is kind of the conversation that goes back to things like salary negotiation. Is I've seen clients, they'll say, hey, I'm making 110, and they get an offer for 120, but they take a major step back, with regard to their total compensation because of the benefits that are associated with, with that. So I think it's really important to understand, what the employer benefits are and how to assess that. So that's really what's at stake here is really understanding that piece. And we know this, Tim, because when we plan to hire someone, we know that it's not just about the salary we pay. We apply a multiple on top of that because we know that the benefits that we're going to provide for that employee are going to be above and beyond that. So that total cost, or what I would say is an investment in that person, is really beyond the salary. So this is what is really that delta that we're trying to assess as an employee to say, okay, how can I best optimize this part of my compensation? And I would say that there's a lot of people that don't necessarily fully optimize this part of their financial plan or give it the attention that it needs because, it sneaks up on us, or bad information or what have you. So that's really kind of the overall picture here of what it is and why it's important.
Yeah. And Tim, I think when you say sneaks up on us, bad information, it's important, I think for folks, basic stuff before we jump into individual benefits, know your dates, obviously, what's the time span. A lot of employers, depending on how they organize this, will do informational sessions, open Q&As, one-on-ones, group. And some of that might be automated, depending on the system and the platform they're using. But making sure, understanding the dates, simple things, how much time do you have if you're going to be on vacation, things like that, making sure you can coordinate with HR. And then also, just taking a look at your pay stub and your benefits and what do you currently have, and really taking a pulse on, and I think just a chance to, go back and, okay, what's, gross pay, what's net pay, what's coming out in benefits, and taking this time that comes around every year as a chance to revisit, some of these things that we want to be looking at often. And then, of course, just thinking about upcoming changes, right, that might be happening. I think of things like, children that might be beneficiaries on the healthcare side, aging out, if you think about 26, or folks that might be expecting, or perhaps, getting married, things that might have an impact on their benefits, considering those things as you're in the benefit selection. And then, of course, just refreshing and updating the evaluation of who are the beneficiaries that are listed on certain policies. Tim, I want to start with health insurance. I think it's the one that typically carries the biggest price tag, as we think about it relative to other insurance, and typically carries more options than things like dental and vision and life and disability, which I think for many employers, it's more of a one-way type of an option. So, I think the big question here is, how do I determine which plan to get? And of course, all plans are created differently, but when folks are looking at these and you're evaluating deductibles and maximum out of pockets and premiums and copays and coinsurance, unfortunately, it's a system that, even though our audience is comfortable with all of those terms because they live in it in the job that they've done or have been trained in it previously, there's just a lot to consider. And if you look at plans, let's consider a 3-tiered plan where you've got like a bronze, silver, gold option. You're looking at, okay, less out of pocket, more out of pocket, better coverage, but perhaps I could have lower out of pocket and I could use that money elsewhere. Like, general framework, how do you begin to help clients think through this decision and not just look at it in a silo, but also consider it in the context of the rest of the plan?
Yeah. So I think it's, everyone can say with me, it depends, right? So, I think a lot of it depends on past history or you mentioned a few things like what's kind of on the horizon, and, is it married or having kids? And some of those will allow you to kind of elect insurance outside of the open enrollment period. Those are typically qualifying events. But, example is when we had Liam, when Shay was pregnant with Liam, we opted out of the bronze package, the HSA plan, and into more of a gold package because we knew that the doctor bills and the hospital bills were going to be there. Our thought process was, although in most cases we're not going to the doctor a lot, during a normal year, we'll elect into a higher deductible plan, which means less coming out of our paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
But then when we do go to the doctor, there's going to be potentially more coming out of our pocket. So we did that to get in front of it a little bit. And, that's really important from a planning perspective and kind of, mitigating as much of the cost. And we probably saved ourselves, if we did the math, a couple $1,000s just by doing that.
Yep.
So that's an important part of the plan. Now, sometimes things are going to come up and you're just not going to, it's kind of like that emergency fund. You're just not going to know, and for the future. But I would say it's a little bit of an exercise in looking at your past history. So looking at how often you're going to the doctor, and how often you're reaching into your pocket to pay for things like copays and things like that. But then also projecting it forward. So that's kind of where the conversation starts. Is that if you're a younger, healthy professional and you're not really going to the doctor, then you probably should really consider, kind of a bronze high deductible, HDHP plan, and couple that with the HSA, which we've said, is a great forum to stash dollars. If you're looking at, regular doctor visits because of a chronic issue or something like that, that's not going to be for you, regardless of your age. You just know that you're going to be in and out of the doctor's office. So I think it's really looking at, again, kind of the budget and seeing what money has been spent on healthcare costs in the past, and then what you think project those going forward. And like I said, like this is not it's important, but these are taking it like snapshots 1 year at a time.
Yep.
So you can like when after Liam was born and the medical expenses were gone, then we went back to the high deductible plan with the HSA. So I think it's really important to kind of take stock of kind of your history, your medical history, your spending in healthcare to form the baseline of your decision in that realm. The other comment I would make, Tim, is not all 401ks are created equal, and as many of us know, not all health plans are created equal. So some are really, really great, and some are really, really terrible. And sometimes that has to do with the size of the organization.
Yeah. Sometimes
just the economies of scale. The bigger that you are, the less that each participant pays, whether that's the 401k or the health insurance plan. So you kind of have to work with the sandbox, that you're playing in, so to speak. And some of that can be very much out of your control.
Yeah. And I think, Tim, your example with Liam is just a great reminder of not putting open enrollment on autopilot. And I think that's what we're trying to stress here, is like using this as a chance to reevaluate each year. What happened last year, what worked last year may or may not be what makes sense for this year for a variety of reasons. And I think this is certainly a place where we want to be evaluating, what does the cash position look like? What does the reserves look like? And how do we feel about that? Especially if we're going to be opting into a high deductible health plan, thinking worst case scenario, hopefully never happens, looking at those out-of-pocket maxes and really asking yourself, how comfortable are we, with that happening? How does that make us feel? And could we weather that storm if it were to come?
Yeah. And, and we've had, some tough conversations with clients that are, deep in credit card debt, and, they really need as much of their income to kind of like right the ship and get them going. So sometimes it means sacrificing or being uncomfortable here. One of the things I look at is like, if we look at all the debts that are out there, medical debt is not necessarily a bad debt in terms of like, they reformed a lot of things with it hurting your credit, because it's kind of been a nightmare. You're typically not gouged, with, higher interest rates and things like that. So typically more forgiven. I would even say pushing back on a lot of medical debt because it's wrong. I think, Tim, you had a story about that when one of your sons was born. So like there's a little bit more give, I would say, than some of these other ones that goes like right to collections and you're in a lot of trouble. So it's kind of, this is all about like mitigating the risk, and trying to understand where can we give a little bit so we're okay.
I want to shift gears, Tim, to life and disability. Probably one of the most common questions that we get is, do I need to purchase additional life and disability insurance beyond what my employer covers? And of course, the answer is it depends on a large part of the individual situation and what they have going on and what they're trying to do with those policies and so forth. But, general thoughts and discussion on how one goes about making this decision in terms of understanding what coverage is there from an employer standpoint, determining what total coverage may be needed, and some of the gap and differences between an employer plan and if they purchased a policy out on the open market.
I think if we look at most pharmacists out there, professionals that are making six-figure salary, I think there's going to come a time when there probably is a need to purchase policies outside of what the employer provides. Now, the problem with the financial services industry is that a lot of quote financial advisors are trying to push those policies on a young professional when they probably don't need them. That's, when you're a pharmacist that has maybe six figures of debt that's going to be forgiven if you die or disabled with no dependents and really, not much on your balance sheet. So there's kind of like this gap of, do I really need this, or can I just, make do with what my employer provides? I'll say this about the employer provided policies. Outside of health insurance, which is a health plan, I would say that things like life and disability insurance are not plans. They're really perks. So they're meant to supplement or meant to provide some type of benefit that will help the employee, but also it's a way to kind of retain you and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I really view these as perks and not necessarily plans. I would say, to your point, Tim, I think it's really looking at the individual and say, okay, does it make sense to buy a policy outside of that? Most employers will provide some type of life insurance benefit, whether it's something like $50,000 or 1 or 2 times income, which you can then elect to either, increase your coverage or not. I think the downside of that is, if you're working for an employer as a 30-year-old and you have all of your eggs in that basket and you're saying, hey, I have $1 million, or a lot of times they're capped. And most times pharmacists need a lot more than what their employer can provide. So that's one of the drawbacks. But if you're working with that company for 40 years and then you leave to go to another organization, which maybe that doesn't provide it, or it's a lot less of a benefit, and you have a gap, then you're going out in the market 10 years older where you're paying a lot more for that particular policy. So that's one of the things. And sometimes they're portable, meaning that you can take them with you, and sometimes they're not. So for both the life and disability, it's really looking at your own situation. Just like open enrollment itself, this is one of the things that's often overlooked, just insurance. And I know we've probably done podcasts in the past about what's proper life and disability and things like that.
Yep.
For the disability, the coverage is typically going to be a percentage of your income. And again, it could be capped, and some employers will offer both long-term and short-term disability. Both are great, but oftentimes because of one reason or another, there's going to be a gap in the coverage, either because of taxes or just that a pharmacist, what they make and what most professionals will say that you need to kind of cover down. And typically that can be anywhere from 50 to 80% of what your income is, that there is a need to go out onto the open market and buy individual policies. But from an open enrollment perspective, I think if you don't have those policies, it's really important to understand what is there for you and what can at least tide you over until you get those policies in place. And again, it's one of those things where it's like, it's not important to you until it's important to you. And and it's really hard to kind of to show that to clients unless they've experienced that pain themselves or a close family member.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a really important piece of protecting the overall financial plan, this is really what this is all about, is, insurance is really protecting the financial plan from a catastrophic event and ensuring that you can continue to, to build wealth and survive, into the future.
Episode 44, Tim, how to determine life insurance needs. 45, how to determine disability insurance needs. 2 that we'll link to in the show notes. We've got more information on the website as well, yourfinancialpharmacist.com. Tim, I think one of the common mistakes I see made here, just relating to that discussion on gap and coverage, is not digging into the policies to really understand, life insurance is maybe the most obvious example where if you have a policy, if you have a need for life insurance and you have a term policy that's offered for 50 or $100,000 or one-time salary, two-time salary. Typically, those have a cap on them.
Yep.
For many folks, there's going to be a gap and a shortage. And I think this is where, sitting down one-on-one with someone to really calculate the total need, think about the transferability issues that you mentioned, and what does it mean if you pick up employment, tax considerations, and really getting into the weeds of some of the nuances of the policies and things like own occupation. We've talked about that before.
Right.
And its importance. And again, thinking about how this fits in with the rest of the plan. And just a shout out here to our fee-only financial planning team at YFP Planning. This is really where I think the value of fee-only comes in that really sitting down with someone to determine what is their true need and their best interest. Not too much coverage that, there's dollars being spent that could be put elsewhere in the financial plan, but making sure we're also not exposing the plan to unnecessary risk.
Yeah, I mean, this what we're talking about here are products. Like insurance is a product.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime that you talk about dispensing advice, hey Tim, you need life insurance, and you say, okay, great, like where do I get it? Like, well, we can sell you this product. There's going to be a conflict of interest. So, having someone that is a fee-only fiduciary that is not further enriched by the advice that they're given, it strips away a lot of that. Well, am I being, advised in my best interest or in the advisor's best interest, the one that's advising me? So that's, I think, the beauty of fee only.
One example I just wanted to give here, I just pulled up, Tim, our long-term disability coverage that we added recently for the YFP team.
Yeah.
And, if you look at it on kind of the main benefits platform, it says 60% monthly income up to $6,000. But this is an example where digging deeper is so valuable. You get into things like, what is the definition of earnings? So our policy, it's base wage. So how you're compensated, right, could have an impact here.
Yep.
What's the elimination period or the time frame from when the disability happens to when the benefit starts to pay out? Here it's 90 days, but if it's, shorter than that, perhaps longer than that, what's the game plan to fund? Does it have own occupation coverage? We've talked about the importance of that before. What's the maximum benefit? Our policy goes up to age 65. And then, things like coverage restrictions, other incentives. So really just a reminder of this time period and using this point in the year to really dig into this information and read the policies.
Yeah, and again, going back to those episodes, I think that you mentioned there, that's where we kind of talk about the nitty gritty. But I think the beautiful thing about this is like when we're reviewing this and we kind of look at we kind of go through the open enrollment optimization stuff is like, as a planner, I'm looking at your balance sheet. So I'm like, all right, does it make sense to bolster, because a lot of these you can opt in. So like our policy doesn't do this, but a lot of policies will say the employer pays for 60% benefit of your earnings, but then you can opt in to get that up to 80%. So you pay an additional,
right? You
pay out of pocket out of your paycheck for that additional 20%. If I'm looking at your balance sheet, Tim, and I'm saying, man, like you have plenty of cash, I would say let's not opt into that. Or we might say let's do it because we know, because the employer is going to pay for it, that benefit you're going to, that benefit's going to be taxed. So if the employer pays for the benefit, it's going to be taxed. That's the gap. So the idea is that looking at your situation and overlaying, what's out there. I think the open enrollment, what I say is, we want to look at the things that you're paying for and say, does it make sense for you to be paying for it? I see a lot of AD&D insurance, and I kind of look at this as like, and again, this is not advice, but I kind of look at those as like when, you buy something at Best Buy and they ask, do you want the warranty? Most of the time you say no, because kind of, it's just not worth the money.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these things in open enrollment it's the same thing. It's like AD&D, for those to pay out is very rare. So even if it's $2 per pay period, I'm like, I just don't think it's worth it. So we're trying to make sure that you're not paying for things that don't necessarily provide you much benefit, much utility, but then you are paying for things that do. And kind of finding that Venn diagram of sorts to make sure that, again, we're fully optimized with regard to this part of your compensation package.
AD&D, for folks that are wondering, accidental death and dismemberment insurance. So Tim Baker dropping some financial lingo here. Tim, next I want to talk about FSAs, dependent care FSAs, especially since we've had some changes that have happened there, as well as HSAs. And we've talked probably among these to the greatest extent, we've talked about HSAs just because of the value of what that can provide, as well as these other options. And we've talked about it on the podcast. We've got some blog posts, episode 165, The Power of a Health Savings Account. Also have an article on the blog, which we'll link to, about really more of the strategic investing side of an HSA, if you're able to do that. So Tim, high level overview: FSA, dependent care FSA, HSA, and some of the differences and considerations for these accounts.
The very crude way that I remember, the difference between FSA and HSA is FSAs are really use or lose. So when you fund these with pre-tax dollars, if you don't use those monies for the purposes of healthcare for an FSA for healthcare, or dependent care for dependent care FSA, you lose it. So it's fudge. Like I don't get, you don't get to use that money. Whereas the HSA, can potentially be an accrual account, meaning that year over year you can stack Benjamins, and hopefully one day becomes that kind of stealth IRA that we talk about that has that triple tax benefit. So like I said, we've talked about the HSA as ad nauseum. It has to be paired with a high deductible health plan. You can put the money in that has a triple tax benefit, which means it goes in pre-tax. It grows tax free, so you can invest it like an IRA, and then you can distribute it in the near term for approved medical costs, or when you reach a certain age, you can use it basically for whatever. So that's the beauty of the HSA. But again, it only works, or you only have access to it when it's paired with a high deductible health plan. The FSA for healthcare is similar but very different. So you're allowed to fund it with pre-tax dollars, meaning if you make $100,000 and you put $1,000 in there, you're taxed on as if you made $99,000. So I think the limits for FSA for 2021, I think it's like $27.50.
That's right.
2007. Yep. Yeah. So the idea is that what you're trying to do here, it's a little bit of a game of chicken. So what you're trying to do is really, again, see into the future and say, okay, what do I know as a baseline that I'm going to use on kind of my out-of-pocket healthcare expenses? And if you know for sure that you're going to be spending, $2,000 on that, then you should fund it with $2,000. And typically there's a little bit of give at the end of the year where you can either carry some over, or you have some time into the new year to use it on
months, or
yeah. And every plan is going to be different in its design. So you might be loading up on kind of some of the over the counter stuff. And I've had client buy a bunch of stuff for like contacts and things like that, and so it's going to be really important to kind of, again, this goes back to the spending plan, the budget, to understand what have you been spending in the past? Is that going to be indicative of what you will spend in the future? And then fund that with at least that baseline amount, so you don't lose it. The same thing can be said for the dependent care of FSA. So this is a pre-tax account that you can fund that is used for care for your child who is under age 13, for before and after school care, babysitting and nanny expenses, daycare, nursery school, preschool, summer day camp, and then also care for a spouse or a relative who is physically or mentally unable to care for themselves and lives in your home. So this money, and this has actually been amended under the American Rescue Plan Act. So I think for single and married filing jointly couples, the pre-tax contribution limit went from where you could use $5,000 a year. Now it's, I think, $10,500.
Significant jump. Yeah,
it's very significant. So the higher limits apply to the plan year beginning December 31, 2020, and before January 1st, 2022. So it is a temporary thing, but it allows you to park some dollars, that you would otherwise. So if you're in a 25% tax bracket, it's as if you're saving 25%, kind of thinking about it that way. So that's what really, and for the FSAs, unlike the FSA it has to be provided by the employer. I think we had a question on the Ask a YFP about the HSA, and you don't have to necessarily go through your employer. Sometimes the employer doesn't offer it, but so you can go out and set up your own HSA. The FSA has to be provided by the employer for you to have access to it. So that's really important. Again, these are all going to be, when you elect it, it's going to take money out of your paycheck and basically fund these accounts for the appropriate purpose.
Yeah, and this to me is where, and when we've talked with Paul Eichenberg, our director of tax, and working with our clients, one of the things he talks about here is these being untapped areas of potential.
Totally.
And so I think, there's a lot of low hanging fruit in the financial plan. And I think really evaluating these, and perhaps the dollars of any one don't jump out as, being super significant. But, I think as we start to add these up with other strategies, there certainly is value. And Tim, you had mentioned we did tackle a question recently on Ask YFP CFP 84. The question was about fees on an HSA account, but we did talk about the opportunity to access an HSA account independent of the employer. So we've talked about health insurance, we've talked about life and disability, we've talked about FSAs and HSAs and dependent care FSAs. I want to wrap up our discussion by retirement saving options. I think, again, this is an opportunity to take a step back, look at the overall progress on the investing part of the plan, overall goals, perhaps gap between the goals and where you're currently at, and then to evaluate where does investing fit in with the rest of the financial plan. And so when we think about, Tim, employer-sponsored retirement accounts, two main buckets we have, which are those that are Roth contributions and those that are traditional. So define for us the difference between those two for folks that are maybe have some outstanding questions about those or unsure, as well as the limits of what we're able to do in 2021.
Yeah. So, and I'll preface this by saying that most of the, open enrollment is a good time to check in on your retirement savings options. You're not necessarily bound to that because you can go in
Correct.
really at any time and say, hey, I was putting in 5%. I talked to YFP plan and they said, hey, I should put in 8%. That'll put me on track to get my, $5 million nest egg. So that's what I want to do. And I can really do that at any time, or I can say, I want less Roth and more traditional, or whatever the case is. So it's just a good opportunity. It's a good checkpoint to say, okay, where am I at, and should I make any tweaks? So, and one of the things that they often do here is they'll allow you to put in an escalator. So, and you can do this at any time too, but it's a good thing that to do an open enrollment. So every year you can increase that by 1 or 2% or whatever that looks like. So to answer your question, Tim, the Roth versus traditional. So most employers will, offer a 401k or a 403b, or if you work for the government, a TSP. So when you elect your retirement options here, a lot of them will now, you'll have a traditional. So think of two buckets. You'll have a traditional 401k and a Roth 401k.
Yep.
And they're all under the same plan, but they segregate the monies because for traditional, these are pre-tax dollars. So that example that I gave you is if you put in $1,000 into your 401k and you make $100,000, your traditional 401k, you make $100,000, your tax is if you made $99,000. For a Roth, it's after tax. So same example, if you put $1,000 into your Roth 401k and you make $100,000, you are taxed as if you make $100,000 because you're not getting that pre-tax deduction. So for these dollars, the money is either taxed going in or coming out. So for a traditional, you're not taxed going in, but then it grows tax-free inside of that account, and then you're taxed when it is distributed, hopefully in retirement. For the Roth 401k, you're taxed going in, so you don't get that deduction, but then it grows tax-free, and when it comes out, it's not taxed because it's already been taxed going in. So a lot of people will say Roth. And again, it's going to depend on your plan. It's going to depend on what you're trying to achieve. And a lot of people get this wrong as well. So this is another good check on it to make sure that you're putting the dollars in the right spot. Your match that your employer provides, if there is a match, is always going to go into a traditional account. So if there is a match, you're going to have some people get it twisted, like, I'm 100% in my Roth 401k, but I see money in my traditional, what gives? And I'm like, well, this is the money that your employer is matching you. It's going to go there, regardless. So it's really important, so to kind of give you some numbers for 2021, to max out a 401k, a 403b, it's $19,500. So you can put that in regardless of how much money you make. So that's really going to be the limit for the 401k. IRAs are a completely different animal. They're $6,000. There's a completely separate counting mechanism. And that's going to be dependent on your income, whether you can put it in directly into a Roth or a traditional IRA, and if you get that deduction. And I know we've had podcasts on that as well. But the point of this, Tim, is that the open enrollment exercise is a great opportunity to kind of just do a once over for your retirement savings options, and just make sure that one, you're in the proper allocation, but then it's also in the Roth versus traditional, and then just making sure that you don't get stuck in that hey, my employer matches, 3%. So, for 10 years, I've just been putting in 3%. You don't want to do that because more often than not, it's not going to be enough for you to retire comfortably. So this is another way, to kind of, check those things and push the envelope a little bit.
Yeah, and I'd point folks back to episode 74 when we talked about evaluating your 401k plan. Also, more recently, episode 208, when we talked about why minimizing fees on your investments is so important. Certainly relevant here as we talk about employer-sponsored retirement plans where we can see a lot of variabilities in those investment options and in the fees. As we've said a couple times now throughout the show, open enrollment, such a great time to take a step back and evaluate the financial plan. And for folks that are going through this process and think, I really see the value in working with someone one-on-one to look at the financial plan holistically, to determine how to prioritize the goals, make some of these decisions around open enrollment, could be debt repayment, investing, tax evaluation, and so forth. We'd love to have a chance to talk with you about the YFP planning, comprehensive financial planning services that we conduct on a one-on-one basis. And you can learn more about those services as well as schedule a free discovery call by going to yfpplanning.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a great rest of your week and look forward to having you join us again next week. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.